This is a making of documentary. I wanted to just record my thoughts for a dialogue free feature film that I want to make solo. But that project needs a lot more time and planning, I think. And I think part of that will be helped by what I record here. And because it's dialogue free, it's going to rely on visual comedy and maybe some physical comedy as well. When I was a kid in England, I was at an infant school, and sometimes initially I would come home for lunch, back to my mum's house, and she would make me lunch. And there was a period of time when they would have Charlie Chaplin short comedies on repeat at lunchtime. So I'd come home from school, watch a Chaplin, maybe watch a cartoon or something, whatever was on at lunch, watch a Chaplin, and then go back to school. So that was like a normal thing for me to do. But I sort of realized in general that's not really a normal thing, because kids between the ages of, I don't know how old I was, maybe somewhere between the ages of 6 and 8, somewhere in that big expanse of time, they wouldn't watch Charlie Chaplin. But I did. It was on TV and I watched it and I got into it. And on Saturday mornings, they had reissues of Harold Lloyd comedies. But they were reissued in a program called Hooray for Harold Lloyd. And they've had a whole theme tune. There was a song, Hooray for Harold Lloyd. Hooray for Harold Lloyd. Harold Lloyd. This whole thing. And what they would do was, to make it more appealing, maybe, they would add in sound effects. And for me now, growing up and having seen a lot more silent movies, for me that sort of adding a whole layer of sound effects takes away something from the charm of those movies as they were intended. If you can see one with just an orchestration and just a soundtrack, I think that works a lot better and it's a lot more interesting for me. And I know there are later filmmakers who would use sound effects, but specifically for Chaplin and Keaton and those guys, and Harold Lloyd, I think it took something away, and it added something that was not very necessary. And then, so I'd never seen any Buster Keaton. I was a teenager in the mid-90s, so around 95, 96, I was at a Blockbuster Video in my nearby town, and they had some Buster Keaton shorts on VHS, which I rented out. And I remember really enjoying them. I watched one with my then girlfriend, and I was laughing because I enjoyed Buster Keaton. I discovered, and I found it funny. I remember her saying to me, "Are you laughing because you know it, because you find it funny, or are you laughing because you know it's supposed to be funny?" Which was an interesting question. But I was laughing because I actually found it funny. We broke up not long after that. So I've had an interest in silent comedy for a long time, and then obviously there were elements in silent comedies. There were elements of visual comedy in other movies growing up. There was obviously a lot in Mel Brooks films.
Yes, sir. How can there be a cassette of Spaceballs the movie? We're still in the middle of making it.
I also, around the time I was getting into Buster Keaton, I was watching the Marx Brothers for the first time. I was discovering those. Obviously, Harper Marx had a lot of similarities to Chaplin.
Now what in the world are we up to? Look at this. The whole house will be torn to pieces. Absolutely.
So it was really, really interesting to me what those guys from a completely different time were able to create. And obviously, you know, films over the last 40 or so years have tried to take, sometimes they've tried to take visual comedy on as much as they can on further. I rewatched Seth Rogen film Neighbours recently, and there's a scene where his neighbours have set up an airbag in his chair at work, and it blasts him into the ceiling.
Why would they just break in and steal an airbag?
I don't know. We should follow police.
Which was I thought was a great visual gag. But I think, you know, sometimes, myself included, rely a lot on dialogue in making films. I've got a film that's coming out at some point. It's with a distributor. It's with Film Hub right now, and hopefully it'll come out at some point on a streaming platform near you, or certainly next to you. And it's Falling for You is the name of the film, and it's a romantic comedy about a woman who's afraid of clowns, but she falls in love with a clown. And I conceived of the movie as sort of a tribute or an homage to the silent films. There are sequences in that film that are shot in black and white and reminiscent of a silent movie. Sort of, you know, tip my hat to, you know, the comedians and the filmmakers I was interested in when I was growing up. So it certainly influenced me to an extent as a filmmaker, but I've had an idea for a long time to make something without dialogue. I tried to, about 20 years ago, I tried to get into the films of Jacques Tati, and I was mildly successful. I didn't really find his films that funny, but I rewatched some recently. I watched Playtime for the first time. About a year ago. I rewatched Mr. Hulot's Holiday. And My Uncle as well. And while they're not gut-bustingly funny, they are really well done, and they're great pieces of cinema. And what I liked about his films is that he was making them he started making them in the 1950s, his feature films. First one, Jour de Fête, the Great Fate or the Great Parade. Was made in, I think it was 1948. What was really interesting is that he made them dialogue free. There's a soundtrack. He made the film completely silent, and then he would essentially remake the film through sound design. And while there is dialogue in his films, the dialogue wasn't important to character development or story development. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And so when I taught myself post-production for my first film, Falling for You, I thought it would be interesting for me to experiment with the sound design and not taking it too far, because for the most part it is the acting is realistic. It's the whole film itself is stylized and slightly heightened, but in general the acting it's naturalistic or realistic, whatever word you want to use. So I didn't really want to push the sounds too far into a cartoon realm, but it was something that I wanted to play with. There's a scene towards the end where the lead character has a hangover and he's waking up on his bed just before the climax of the film, and where he goes to try to win back the woman he's broken up with. And there I was able to play with, the idea that, if you're waking up with a hangover, you have everything is extremely loud, or you feel like there is construction vehicles happening or construction somewhere in your head. So I actually wove that in. Those are the sort of sounds that get exaggerated when you have a hangover, or you feel like there's always that happening somewhere when you're not feeling in a great way. So I wanted to play around with that in that feature film. But the idea for this silent project is, one, because I'm interested in working on my visual comedy and physical comedy more, but also because I wanted to try the Jacques Tati approach of, creating a film without dialogue, but that exists obviously visually, but also through sound as well, through sound design. And I've done this before, I put together a document for myself, creating visual comedy, and it's compiled by me. And what I did was I did this before. I created a document for myself from interviews on screen with screenwriters, working professional screenwriters. Sometimes their advice can be a little bit different to what you may read in books, which I think is interesting. And I also put together sort of like a general one about filmmaking, because I never went to film school. I went to drama school. I trained as an actor originally, but I've always been interested in film and filmmaking, and I wanted to try and figure out how to make a film when I was in drama school in the late 90s. And I got a camcorder. I was able to film bits and pieces, but I didn't know how then to get it off the tape and then to be able to edit it. And I read books about filmmaking, and it just seemed like an enormous task, getting the video off the tape and then somehow cutting it together. That was completely beyond my realm of understanding for some reason, in the late 90s, early 2000s. So, I focused on, I've written different things, my whole life, writing little sketches and trying to write plays and things when I was a kid, and short stories, and that eventually became, I started experimenting with writing stand-up as a teenager, and I was writing plays at the same time. Initially I wrote one that was really influenced by the Marx Brothers. It didn't turn out too well. It just I had no idea about structure or story, any of those things. So I've always written, and I've always tried to write plays, because they were plays that wanted to be films, because I had no idea how to make a film. The technology was just not there, and my understanding of the technology that was there wasn't very good, and I didn't know anybody, and I wasn't able to meet anybody who was able to, tap into what it was I was trying to do. So I just ended up writing plays that were really wanted to be films until I emigrated, had a script, and through a whole series of events managed to get a feature film produced and filmed. It was filmed on a DSLR. But now, we're at a point where people film things in a variety of ways. There was a Zoom movie that was made during the pandemic. People film things on cell phones and a whole variety of other things, as well as, film cameras. So I've assembled this document for myself because this is sort of like my film school. I taught myself post-production on my feature film, the whole post-production process, editing, sound editing, design, color grading and correction, the whole everything. And that was sort of it took me 2 years part-time to finish it. Started in April 2020 and finished it April 2022. That's when the initial release happened on a dedicated website. But I know there's more information to know. There are more things to learn. So I was interested in visual comedy. So I put together this document, and it's a collection of interviews, mostly. There's some interviews with the Coen brothers, Barry Sonnenfeld. Because they worked together really early on, it's interesting to see how there are a lot of overlaps between how they film comedy, whether it's just visual comedy or whether it's dialogue-driven comedy, but filmed to make it more visually interesting. I thought it was important to learn information about what they think. There are some notes here about Buster Keaton. There's a very good documentary series, Every Frame a Painting, and Tony, who made that show, had a very good episode called Buster Keaton, The Art of the Gag. I also have notes from, it was a documentary series in the UK called Laughing Matters that came out in the 90s. They released one episode on VHS, which I bought, called, I think it was called Visual Comedy, and it was hosted by Rowan Atkinson. And I rewatched that recently. That I used to own that for a long time and just watch it over and over and over again. Some people, when they were teenagers, were discovering, Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd. I was discovering Chaplin, Keaton, Mel Brooks. That's what I was doing. And I watched this Laughing Matters Rowan Atkinson documentary over and over again, and I found it online recently, and I made some notes from there. I thought that was intriguing to look at, certainly in light of the project I want to undertake. I wanted to experiment with my kids, or maybe on my kids, with a couple of the ideas presented in the Rowan Atkinson documentary. One of the notes that I made from Laughing Matters, the visual comedy documentary, were the 3 basic principles of visual comedy. 1. An object or person can become funny by behaving in an unexpected way. 2. An object or person can become funny by being in an unexpected place.
Hello.
3. An object or person can become funny by being the wrong size. I also have a few notes from Harold Lloyd. I found an ebook version of The Total Filmmaker, which is a book that Jerry Lewis wrote. I think it's based on a series of lectures he did about filmmaking, comedy and filmmaking. I'm not 100% sure whether he taught for a period of time or whether it was just like a series of lectures, but they essentially were transcribed and then turned into a book, The Total Filmmaker. So I took some notes, made some notes from that for myself. I found an interesting article by someone called David Bordwell, which I put in here and I've referenced for myself. again, he talks about the Coen brothers and Barry Sonnenfeld, and so there is a lot of repeat information there. There was also I have notes about Edgar Wright's filmmaking, and again there was an episode of Every Frame a Painting which dealt with how Edgar Wright makes visual comedy. I also have notes from an interview with a director of photography called Julio Macat. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but he was the DP on Pitch Perfect, first two Home Alone movies. I think it was, I've got Ace Ventura written down here. I think that might be correct. And a movie called Life at the Party. And what's interesting is that when I've looked at his interview, there is overlap between some of the things that he's been saying with some of the things that Barry Sonnenfeld and the Coen brothers have been saying. Here's a quote from Harold Lloyd. "Comedy is tension. The more you get a man into trouble, the more comedy you get out of him." Okay? I need to get into trouble. Be the best at what you do. Okay? A gimmick creates an image, but humanity creates a legacy. Create your thrill first, worry about the rest later. I guess that works with the thrill comedies that he made. He made Feet First, and then he made Safety Last. I only ever saw Safety Last. I didn't see Feet First. Safety Last is a great one, though. He also said, there was also a quote, "Comedy is naturalism," and his quote is, "The man who tries to be funny is lost. To lose one's naturalness is always to lose the sympathy of your audience." And the last note about Harold Lloyd is, "Be able to do something extraordinary." I guess walking around the structure of a skyscraper was kind of extraordinary, as was climbing a building, which I learned, I watched the documentary Harold Lloyd, the Third Genius, recommended. He had a stunt. He was posing for a photograph, and he had a stunt bomb, but it was a real bomb, and it exploded, and he lost part of his hand, on his right hand. So what he had to do was he had a glove and two pieces of wood inserted in the glove, so it looked like he had a complete hand. So he wore gloves, or I don't know whether he wore two, but he certainly wore a glove when he was making his later films. Certainly he had a glove and a missing hand when he made Safety Last. So the stunt where he's climbing up the side of the building, he only has 3 fingers on his right hand to do that. And so part of it he had to do with a stunt double because it was physically impossible. I think some of those would work. Some of those thoughts about visual comedy. Obviously, there's a lot of Jacques Tati's approach to filmmaking I want to play with. So here's a quick reference guide I put together for myself. He basically didn't use close-ups, so I'm not sure if that's something I want to follow or not. Because when I'm looking at the information I've gleaned from interviews with Barry Sonnenfeld, the Coen brothers, and Julio Macat, they did use close-ups. So I'll have to see, and I have to experiment to see how I feel about that. He used long shots, shots that are on screen for a long time as well. He also filled the frame with information.
À toi, Jean.
So let's have a look at Barry Sonnenfeld and the Coens. Okay, here's a direct quote. "Lenses are great tools. Let them work for you. Wide-angle lenses are funny. Telephoto lenses are handsome. If you're using lenses longer than 21mm, you'd better have a damn funny script and really funny actors." Okay. the 21mm lens shooting a close-up of Will Smith, which is what I do. Will's ears are in Philadelphia and his nose is in Los Angeles. He's got small ears and they are far away from the rest of his face. I wanted to experiment with this idea using my kids. Here we're using an iPhone 12. The 1x lens is equivalent to a 26mm lens or wide angle. Next we have on the iPhone 12 a 0.5x lens, which is equivalent to 13mm or an ultra wide angle lens. Here we are experimenting with the wide angle lens on my 7-year-old, who can't seem to contain his laughter. And now we're trying with the ultra wide angle lens equivalent of 13mm. Again, he still can't control himself. They say never work with animals or children who are animals. In addition, comedy plays best in 2 shots. Action and reaction in the same shot. Okay? I certainly had action and reaction 2 shots in Falling for You. Alright. Make a habit of it. Right. There are certainly elements between interplay between 2 characters. One person would say something, another person would reply or react. But given that my dialogue-free project is a solo project, and I'm planning to play more than one character, I don't know if that's going to be possible. I mean, say for doing some sort of a visual effect, which I could probably do in Final Cut Pro, I'm not really a visual effects person. Certainly not yet. And it goes on to say that Cary Grant dressed in a bathrobe, Katharine Hepburn calling him Mr. Bone. It's funny because you can see them both in the same shot.
Oh, but there's somebody else in the room.
No, David, there was nobody else in the room but... David, George.
Who's George?
The dog. You know, don't you see? Dog, bone, dog, bone.
Oh! George!
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 George! Oh, stop it, Susan. You sound like an echo.
The Coen brothers. So they keep their shots simple and precise. Notes here say you won't see a ton of camera work, handheld work, or rack focuses in the Coen's dialogue scenes. And if you do, it's a simple push in. They have a simple setup, 2 or more people having a conversation, but they're very precise in the set design, wardrobe, and positioning of the camera. Okay? They shoot a lot of singles. This is interesting. The Coens like to shoot dialogue from within the space of the conversation. Many other dialogue scenes are shot in a series of over-the-shoulder shots. Okay, so you can see the shoulder of one of the characters. I wanted to experiment with this idea using my kids, which went as well as you'd expect.
What do you want to do? Let's talk about the NFL teams. What's your least favorite NFL team? Poop.
This is from an article called 5 Ways to Nail Comedy Cinematography from Home Alone DP Julio Macat. He specifically talked about style when shooting comedy, saying that when he first started in the industry, comedies were shot in a kind of a bright way, less contrast. I've been able to do comedies that are less bright, more rich, he added. Okay? Step 1, get the goods. In comedies, every scene is written with a purpose and everything happens for a reason. Julio Macat calls that the goods of the scene and suggests finding out or thinking about why the writer wrote the scene, what the point is, and then decide where you would need to place the camera if you had to tell the entire scene in one shot from one angle. That's really interesting, especially because I'm not going to have a script. For the solo dialogue-free project I'm thinking about making, it's going to be a very detailed outline, but there's not going to be a script as such. But I guess I need to be as detailed as I can. Maybe I need to plan out some of the shots, or at least some of the gags, so I know what I'm doing. That could be a really useful thing to do. Again, here he is again. Look, here's another. So they, like I was saying earlier on, they all seem to be cut from a similar cloth. So it's certainly something I'm going to experiment with and see if it works. Shoot wide and close. Macat's tactic of using a wide-angle lens close to the subject began by the team placing a third wide-angle bonus cam, as Macat called it, as he fallback to the two primary camera angles in case the team missed the gag in a scene. But as it turned out, the wide and close approach really ended up informing the aesthetic of Home Alone for several reasons. Okay. The team realized when watching dailies that the shots that evoked the best reactions were actually the ones shot with a bonus cam. The angles seemed to just work better than the others, and so they began thinking in a more deliberate way about how bonus cam could be deployed in the rest of the movie. Work musically. Macat insists that if you listen to music while you're operating, the product of your camera work is completely different than if you don't. He recalls that they played lots of music on the set of Home Alone, which helped get their timing down. He also mentioned that he started out shooting concerts and music videos, and so he had always been used to thinking musically and is constantly aware of how his camera movements would map to a musical score, which he feels makes a huge difference in the final piece. During the discussion, Macat mentioned that when watching accomplished camera operators, it's always obvious which of them has a musical background. That could be a possibility for this, because I'm planning to, it's going to be dialogue free, and I'm planning to create a whole soundtrack separately to the film itself. And by soundtrack, I'm also including, Foley and sound effects and all that sort of stuff in that, as well as music. So it could be possible for me to play music on set. Because I'm not sure about Harold Lloyd, but certainly I've seen Jerry Lewis, do silent comedy bits in sync to music. Edgar Wright.
Okay, John, it's time at the bar.
But there's a lot of repetition on a lot of these. They would recycle some of the same routines. There was a Chaplin did a boxing routine. Keaton did a boxing routine. Jerry Lewis did a boxing routine. I remember Jerry Lewis did a routine where he's arguing or shouting in time to jazz that was played by Count Basie's orchestra. And Billy Crystal did something similar in a late 80s comedy special that he had, that he performed in Russia. So it's interesting that there are a lot of routines or gags get repeated. It's interesting because I've also been rewatching the documentary Everything is a Remix, where Kirby Ferguson, the creator, talks about the fundamental building blocks of creativity are copy, transform, and combine. The quote, comedy should be in a long shot, and drama should be in a close-up, that's not 100% strict. I guess it more was in the black and white silent era, because the comedians and the comedy performers, you would see their whole body. They would act with their entire body, because a lot of them came from vaudeville or they came from British music hall. And so they were used to showing their entire bodies and clowning and this sort of stuff and slapstick. So that was certainly more important then to see, because you came to see the comedian, you didn't come to see the film. And the way you got to see the comedian was through the film. But now, because the art of filmmaking has progressed quite considerably in the last 100 years, you know, we're a lot more used to seeing filmmaking techniques and, you know, different approaches, and we're a lot, as audiences, we're a lot more aware of the film and you know and the techniques, that we can see those techniques now. You know, we're back in the day, you know, if you saw a train coming towards you, you actually believed a real train was coming towards you. But now, you know, audiences are so sophisticated that we're used to seeing, you know, the techniques and things going fast or slow, or you know, fast transitions. Edgar Wright has a lot of, you know, match cuts.
Wallace, how do you do that? Wallace!
I know that there are some other filmmakers I've been watching recently who are interested in Yasujiro Ozu, as a Japanese filmmaker, and Bela Tar, as a Hungarian filmmaker. I've seen one of Yasujiro's films, which was really, really interesting because it's really, really slow and contemplative. It takes its time. Haven't seen any of Bela Tar's works, but I've made notes about them both, and what I'm interested in is how their approach to filmmaking, even though they don't specifically focus on making comedies, I'm interested in the idea of just taking time with things, letting things just develop, whether that's the story or the characters. It's taking your time with something. And then, you know, Ozu had something that was described as pillow shots, where you would just see, maybe if you were looking at a restaurant scene with characters, and then it would cut to a shot of the restaurant completely empty afterwards, and then be cut to something else, or cut back to the restaurant full with the characters again. Something like that, giving the audience a visual break to chew over what they've just watched, could be interesting. I don't know if it would work for this, but it's certainly a technique that I'm looking forward to experimenting with on some other future projects that I've got planned for this year. I mean, I don't know, maybe being inspired by Ozu's pillow shots could work. But I'm just concerned that, you know, I know personally, comedy should have a certain pace to it. You know, I don't think, my taste, comedy shouldn't last longer than an hour and a half, 90 minutes, and you're done. Because what else is there, right? You know, when you start getting into 2 hours, 2.5 hours for a comedy, is it really necessary? Maybe. I don't really think so. Just get in, get out, you know. Comedy should be about pace, I think. Not really, not ridiculously fast, but there should be a certain movement. You know, everything's constantly moving. So maybe the contemplative shots that I was just talking about with Ozu might not be the right tone for this, or tone for some of the for any of the comedies I'm making. You know, I've got some comedy dramas in the pipeline. So maybe I could experiment with that with them. But certainly with this dialogue-free solo project, I think there needs to be a certain continuous pace. Things are continually moving forward. We're not stopping to chew things over, to contemplate things. You know, we're getting our information, getting our story and our character development, getting our laughs, and then moving on. I think everything should be constantly driving forward. I don't think I should be taking my foot off the gas, as it were. Whereas, you know, some of the other stuff I'm thinking about for later in the year, I think it would be worth, you know, taking the pedal off the metal, as they say. I think it would be easier to do that with some of the more common dramas, essentially, especially when I'm working with other people, slowing things down a little bit, giving a different sort of visual interest. Whereas I think with this, I'm not sure if that's going to be the right thing. Who knows? I'm saying this now, like I said, you know, when I get into post-production on that solo project, I might feel differently. But right now, I think the pillow shots from Ozu might not be a good thing. But I'm certainly going to experiment and play around with some of the other stuff I was talking about. We'll have to see. It'll be a fun journey.